Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome to another technical webinar for our Salt Basins TIG. Today we have a really special guest. We have Dr. Maggie Ellis Curry, who is currently a professor at the University of Houston. And she is giving a presentation on some of her work from her first postdoc from UT Austin, working with Mike Hudek in the BEG and that group. The AGL group. Just to give you a little bit more background about Maggie, she is currently an assistant professor of tectonic basins and subsurface processes at U of H. She got her MS at UT Austin, and then she worked for Exxon in Houston before she returned to graduate school, where she worked on her PhD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 2015. After her stint at the BEG with the AGL in salt tectonics, so this project, she went on for a second postdoc at the University Grenoble Alpes in France, working on the Pyrenees geology. She has been at U of H since January 2020, and she currently works in basins and mountains around the world, striving to understand feedback between tectonic basin development and surface processes in various tectonic settings. So with that, Maggie, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you everyone for being here.
Great. Thanks very much, Rochelle. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending where you are. Thanks for the nice intro. As Rochelle said, my name is Maggie Ellis Curry. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Houston. And today I'm going to tell you about some work that was done mostly while I was a postdoc with the Applied Geodynamics Laboratory at UT Austin a few years ago. And this work involved constructing 4 structural restorations, 2 in the US and 2 in Mexico, to address the conjugate margin structural evolution. And this work has benefited from a lot of collaboration with folks in the AGL group, and also John Snedden with the Gulf Basin Depositional Synthesis Project. So I really want to acknowledge all of my collaborators who helped with this work. So this being a salt basin series of talks, most folks in attendance are probably at least a little familiar with the Gulf of Mexico, but I'm going to start with a brief introduction to this complex basin. So the Gulf of Mexico is a passive margin salt basin that formed during the Mesozoic breakup of Pangaea. The basin contains up to 15 kilometers of sediment, including several kilometers of mobile salt that facilitates a lot of gravity-driven salt tectonics and obscures much of the subsalt geology in our attempts to image it seismically. So here is just a very sort of general tectonic sequence for the Gulf of Mexico. Starting in somewhere around the late Triassic, when Pangaea began to break up, there was this northwest-southeast directed rifting. Somewhere between 170 and 165 MA, there was massive salt deposition, which we believe happened very rapidly somewhere in this window. And then the northwest-southeast rifting transitioned to sort of this counterclockwise rotation of Yucatan that was facilitated by seafloor spreading in the basin. And this occurred in the late Jurassic. And then the present configuration that we see today was established about 140 million years ago. So this, extensional origin, this general sort of tectonic history is generally agreed upon, but some of the details of how this basin formed is still a matter of debate. So I want to go over what we do know for sure about this basin, what we can actually observe from data. So first, the middle of the basin contains oceanic crust. So we know the basin extended sufficiently for full lithospheric rupture. This is, of course, the gravity map from Sandwell et al. 2014. And you can see these sort of dark shadows of lines that represent that extinct spreading center. So here's our interpretation of that spreading center. Also on here is our interpretation for the limit of oceanic crust and the limit of continental crust. And then this hatched zone here represents this sort of nebulous zone of uncertain crustal type. What else? Well, we're fairly certain, based on the depositional patterns of the Jurassic stratigraphy, that the basin continued to grow via emplacement of oceanic crust during Mesozoic deposition. So if you were to map the stratigraphic terminations of Jurassic units, they progressively onlap oceanic crust, or downlap would probably be the more correct term. So this is shown somewhat schematically here, that as the Jurassic proceeds, that oceanic crust is being further and further emplaced. What else do we know? Based on seismic reflection data, we know that the continental crust is highly extended and thinned. So this is a map of crustal thickness based on my own mapping in the Eastern Gulf. And so the red sort of hot colors here, and my apologies if you have difficulty with color blindness, but this zone up here, where it's sort of red colors, this is really thick crust, up to 35 kilometers thick. And you can see it rapidly thins to the blue thickness of oceanic crust, which is about 6 to 10 kilometers thickness. And I've also superimposed that limit of oceanic crust that we interpreted, and this pink area is that zone of uncertain crustal type. So you can see is that the continental crust thins pretty drastically even before the oceanic crust begins to be in place. So we know quite a lot, but what don't we know? Well, there's a lot we actually still don't know here. So for one, we don't know much about the differences and similarities between the conjugate margins, or how the two co-evolved. So the US margin has been the focus of numerous sedimentologic, stratigraphic, structural studies due to this very robust subsurface record in the history of hydrocarbon exploration and production. Relatively less is known about the Mexican conjugate margin, just due to lack of widespread available data. Hopefully that is beginning to change. But as a result, the coevolution of the two margins remains somewhat speculative. Second, we don't know a lot about the paleogeography or precise tectonic setting of the original salt basin. The recent work by my colleague Frank Peel has put forth some very compelling ideas about that setting. We don't know how the margin proceeded precisely from rift to drift. So there are a lot of models that exist for extensional margins in general, and about that many have been proposed for the Gulf of Mexico. So we're learning more, but the honest truth is we don't really know the precise tectonics of that transition. And finally, we don't know a lot about the geodynamics of the Gulf of Mexico, in the sense that we don't know to what degree it's been subject to mantle influences, mantle upwelling and mantle downwelling. So there's a lot we don't know. So, but why is this the case? Why is there so much we don't know? Why, in arguably the most thoroughly researched basin in the world, are there still so many unanswered questions? Well, several factors make this a really tricky problem here. First is that potential field techniques are relatively inconclusive at the level of precision we really need. So these are gravity and magnetic maps of the Gulf of Mexico, but unfortunately, they're not really showing us anything more than we already knew. One reason they are so inconclusive is because of this very thick post-drift stratigraphy. And so it's very thick, and it contains an enormous amount of salt. That stratigraphy obscures that basement architecture, the crustal structure, in really key areas. Furthermore, well penetrations into the pre-salt are sparse, and they're not really in the areas that we would hope they would be to help us sort of solve this mystery. So this image here, I know it's probably small and hard to see, but those black dots show the location of subsalt well penetration. So you see they're focused on shore. They're not really in that zone of uncertain crustal type where it could really solve our mystery. And finally, there's also, as I said, there's limited data from the southern Gulf of Mexico. So it remains a difficult problem. So in my talk today, I'm going to utilize new, or at least it was new a few years ago when I did this, data from the Mexican domain, this 2D seismic data from the Mexican domain, and 2D and 3D seismic data from the US domain, and all of which is constrained by the many, many wells that have been drilled. I constructed 4 sequential structural restorations using MOVE software, 2 from the US and 2 from Mexico that are approximate conjugates at the time of salt deposition. So they're no longer conjugates today due to that rotation of Yucatan. This map shows my approximate locations. I can't show you the exact location of the lines that I used, but US1 and MX1, which are conjugates in the east, and then US2 and MX2, which are conjugates towards the west. And then as that basin broke apart, they separated. So, we have sort of this list of key unknowns that I just went over. And in my talk today, I don't promise to unequivocally answer all of these, but I will address them, and I'll add some more information and observations that might bring us to a greater understanding, or it might just bring up new questions, which would also be fun. Okay, so as part of this research, we reconstructed the original salt basin. And here's where I need to acknowledge that the presence of salt introduces a lot of uncertainties to our structural restoration because it violates a lot of our rules. Salt flow it's 3-dimensional. It's going to flow out of the plane of investigation. The cross-sectional area is not constant due to that out-of-plane movement and dissolution. And it can mask deformation by sort of growing and squeezing diapirs. We follow the best practices that have been laid out for structural restoration in salt basins, but we also establish a few rules of our own to minimize uncertainty. So these rules are, first of all, we pin the up-dip pinch out of salt. So in the up-dip direction, the pinch out of salt is the same at the present day as it was at the time of salt deposition. So due to gravitational forces, which move basinward, they move down the slope, that modern up-dip extent can be confidently assumed to represent that original limit. So we keep that the same. We allow a 1-degree slope on the top of salt at the time of deposition. After recent research has shown that is physically possible and even likely. What else? We keep the conjugate depths approximately equivalent. That just makes sense. If we're saying it's a conjugate line, then they should be about the same. What else? We allow the cross-sectional area of salt to decrease through time. So the cross-sectional area of the original salt basin is greater than the salt at present. So we don't know how much dissolution may have occurred, but we try to use, to the degree that we can, the sort of first post-salt deposits, which in the deep water tend to be mini basins. We use that to help constrain our thicknesses. We know the salt must have been at least that thick at the time, sort of when they were deposited to hold and allow migration of those mini basins. So we use the evidence that we can to constrain that, but we do allow the cross-sectional area to change through time. And then finally, we established that the smallest the salt basin could have been, the original salt basin, is the basinward limit of continental crust, or what we interpret as the basinward limit of continental crust. Our reasoning being that the sort of syn salt and post salt extension and exhumation that we observe is all focused down dip. Right, so it's not focused up here, sort of, right under the salt basin. It's all focused down dip. So the continental crust must have been there for the salt to be deposited on top of it. So by that reason, we say that the salt basin couldn't have been smaller than that limit. Okay, so those are our rules. Here is the just some more business. Here's the stratigraphy and nomenclature I'll be using today. So I adopt the GBDS super sequence terminology, which is shown here in this stratigraphic column. This is also what I used in all of my seismic mapping. And here is the geologic timescale equivalent of those super sequences. Okay, so now that I've established the rules to play, let's get on with the game. So I'm going to walk through first the Eastern conjugates and then the Western And I'm going to start with line US1, which is approximately right here. This is the eastern US conjugate. So this line starts up on the carbonate platform. It stretches across the Florida escarpment, eventually crossing into the oceanic crust domain. This interpretation is based on 2D with supplemental 3D seismic data. And a few things that I want to point out here, and I'm going to kind of use this first one as a way to point out things that will be consistent as I walk through all the restorations. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the crustal interpretation. So the pre-salt and crustal geology is notoriously difficult to interpret in the Gulf of Mexico due to poor seismic imaging for the reasons I've already discussed. So here, what I do is I'll just describe key observations of the subsalt and crustal architecture by broadly characterizing 5 terrains: oceanic crust, exhumed mantle or lower crust, continental crust. This is an upper pre-salt mega sequence or UPM and a lower pre-salt mega sequence or LPM. So the upper pre-salt mega sequence is characterized by transparent continuous bedding. It's subparallel to the base of the salt. It's occasionally erosionally truncated or deformed by normal faulting. And the UPM onlaps and buries the lower pre-salt mega sequence or the LPM. And the boundary between these two is often a bright seismic reflection. So the LPM is characterized by much higher seismic reflectivity. And occasionally you see these sort of down to the basin normal faults. Oceanic crust is identified by, sort of the normal seismic waves. It's this bright, rough reflector at the interface with the overlying sediment. And it has a seismic moho at 6 to 10 kilometers depth. Continental crust is interpreted to be crystalline basement. It reaches thicknesses of 25 to 30 kilometers in the most proximal stretches. Occasionally, we observe a deep, bright sort of continent dipping reflector that is interpreted to be the continental moho. Now, between oceanic crust and the continental crust is a domain characterized by poor seismic imaging and lack of a moho. And we interpret this terrain as either exhumed mantle or lower crust. Okay, so let me point out some key things about this line. For one, there's a lot of relief on the base of salt here. As you can see, these normal faults cut that pre-salt section. The salt at present has 43 kilometers squared cross-sectional area, and it spans 130 kilometers. The Jurassic section, which is in blue, is thickest over the salt and has significant salt facilitated deformation in the form of normal faults and mini basins and squeezed diapirs. Okay, so let's get on with the restoration. What I'm going to start with is the salt step, and then I'm going to walk forward. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to show 4 steps for all of these restorations: the salt deposition, the top of the Smackover, the top of Jurassic, and the top of the Cretaceous. So in the original salt basin, the salt was about 1.5 kilometers thick at its thickest. And the relief on the top of salt, which can also be thought of as the water depth, is about 1.2 kilometer. This salt was deposited pre-exhumation, but sin thinning. So the continental crust had undergone a lot of thinning at the time of deposition. At the top of the Smackover, we observe a lot of up-dip extension, but the down-dip region is a thick mini basin province. At the top of the Jurassic, the mini basins have mostly all been grounded. There's near continuous deposition into the distal deep water, with the exception of one continually growing diapir. And then in the Cretaceous, you have significant carbonate platform development and really only minimal influence of salt tectonics. So here's what all of those stages of the restoration look like. And there's a few observations here that you will see are trends across all the restorations. So for one is this early, this sort of lower Jurassic period of up dip extension with a down dip, thicker deposits that you often take the form of mini basins. The majority of the salt the salt facilitated deformation occurs in the Jurassic. You still see usually some through the end of the Mesozoic, but the gross majority of it occurs in the Jurassic. The Jurassic stratigraphy tends to be thickest over the salt basin, whereas the Cretaceous tends to thin over that region and be thicker basinward. And this line isn't the best example of that. You can kind of see that, but I'll be sure to point it out on the other lines where it's pretty dramatic. Okay, so let's move on to the line MX1. So this is the conjugate for the line we just went over. This line starts on the Yucatan platform and stretches northwest, eventually crossing into the oceanic crust domain. This interpretation is based only on 2D seismic data, and we have no well control up on the platform, which really limits our resolution there. Just in contrast to the previous line, there is little to no relief here on the base of salt. It dips fairly smoothly basinward until you reach this feature that I'll be calling the outer marginal trough, which is sort of this downward step and then upward step. Again, you can see those two pre-salt sequences. And what else? Oh yeah, so the salt here at present has a cross-sectional area of 17 kilometers square and it spans 70 kilometers. Again, you'll see that thickest Jurassic section over the salt, heavily influenced by salt structures. In fact, the salt deformation here is really limited to the Mesozoic. Okay, so let's look at the restoration of this one. So here's the original salt basin. The salt was about 1.2 kilometers thick here at its thickest, and the water depth was again 1.2 kilometers. And again, this is deposited in sort of a pre-exhumation setting. So we don't have the well control here to say confidently that this unit, this horizon I interpreted, is the top of the smackover. So we call it lower Jurassic undifferentiated. And here again, we observe this up dip salt detached extension, and then this down dip region, which is potentially a mini basin province, not great resolution there. You also see the salt canopy flowing out over the down dip area. At the top of the Jurassic, most of the deformation is done with the exception, again, of sort of one continually growing diapier. And then the Cretaceous, again, you see this really significant carbonate platform development and very minimal influence of salt tectonics by the time you get to this point. So here again are all those stages of the restoration. And again, you really see the thickest Jurassic deposits right over the salt basin, and then the Cretaceous tends to sort of thin over it. Sometimes even here you see it pinches out and it's discontinuous with those platform deposits. Okay, so here's the conjugate restoration. This is the same thing you've just seen. It's just put together a little more nicely. And I want to focus here on this interpretation of what that salt basin looked like. So the full salt basin was 175 kilometers all the way across. And the maximum salt thickness was 1.2 to 1.5 kilometers. It changes a little based on that basement morphology. The water depth here was 1.2 kilometers. And the way I've interpreted this is that these were deposited in a basin that was in existence prior to that mantle exhumation. That shortly after the salt was deposited, you see that crustal split and the mantle split, and you see the onset of oceanic crust deposited. I do interpret a little bit of salt basin widening, a little bit of sort of allochthonous salt flow between the period of deposition and the period of split, which makes sense considering that this is an extending basin. Okay, so now let's start with the Western restoration, and Western is used relatively here because it's still in the Eastern GOM, at least on the US side. So here's line US2. It's based on 2D with supplemental 3D seismic data. And this is a really tough line because it traverses the Appalachicola embayment over the Florida Middle Ground Arch and before crossing into the oceanic crust domain. So due to this basement morphology, it's really not possible to orient a section that is a true dip line throughout the full restoration time frame, right? Because when you're in the Appalachian embayment, the transport direction was different. So you certainly had out of plane movement up here. And so because of this, it's kind of useful to divide the line up into the northern and the southern regimes. And the southern section does constitute an approximate dip line during the Mesozoic. So it's really going to be the focus of this discussion. There's moderate relief on the base of salt here before it crosses out into the oceanic crust domain. You can see especially high relief in this outer marginal trough region. At present, the salt has a cross-sectional area of 140 kilometers squared, and it spans 260 kilometers. That's the full salt basin, the whole thing. I have put in brackets here what the amount is in just the southern regime, in case you're interested. Again, you see the Jurassic section here is thickest over the salt and heavily influenced by salt tectonics. The salt actually influences stratigraphy here as young as the Pleistocene. And something that's interesting, and I'll point it out again on the next slide, is that the youngest Jurassic unit, this dark blue, which would be sort of the deep water Norphlet equivalent. Of course, it would be very different than the Norphlet we're used to up in the more proximal stretches. You know, these are really thick deposits, almost certainly marine. What's interesting is you can actually observe them onlapping what we have interpreted as this exhuming mantle. So that actually helps sort of potentially date the timing of that exhumation. Okay, so let's get on with the restoration. In the original salt basin, the salt was about 2 kilometers thick at the most, and that's up in the Apalachicola embayment. In the southern regime, the salt was about 1.2 kilometers. The relief on the top of salt, in other words, the water depth, is about 1.5 kilometers. And again, this was deposited in sort of a pre-exhumation but sin thinning basin. I'm going to focus now more on the southern part as I continue this description. At the top of this smackover, we see these really thin beds deposited over the Florida Middle Ground Arch. And contemporaneously, there is a significant thick mini basin province down dip. And here's where I sort of tried to draw in how you can really see this, these units sort of onlapping the growth of that exhuming mantle. So yeah, you see this really thick Jurassic being deposited over the salt basin. And as we move on to the end of the Jurassic, those really thin basins that were on top of the Florida Middle Ground Arch have migrated a bit, and they will ultimately juxtapose themselves against these thick mini basins. Most of the salt tectonics had slowed or ceased by the end of the Jurassic, though you do see some lingering faulting and diapir growth through the Cretaceous. And again, by the top of the Cretaceous, you see this significant carbonate deposition. You see really thin here, really thin Cretaceous over that salt basin, indicating that it was a topographic hide at that point. So here's what those sections all look like. You can see this really thick Jurassic over the salt, really thin Cretaceous in that same area. So the locus of deposition really shifts from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous. Okay, so finally, this is the final line. This is line MX2. This is the conjugate of the line we just looked at. And this line is based on 2D seismic data. Here, there are some pretty major up-dip normal faults, but once you enter the salt basin, it's very smooth, gently dipping base of salt until it hits that outer marginal trough where you have a lot of relief. At present, the salt here has 45 kilometers squared cross-sectional area, and it spans 160 kilometers. The Jurassic section here is significant. This is the thickest Jurassic we see in any of the lines, and it is thickest in the salt basin. It is affected by the salt tectonics. You see those extensional salt rollers, the squeezed diapirs, and there's this Miocene age normal fault that cuts the crest of this salt cord anticline over the outer marginal trough. So here's the restoration, starting with the original salt basin. The salt here was about 1.8 kilometers thick at its thickest, and the water depth is again about 1.5 kilometers. This So this line has a pretty significant amount of salt basin widening, what amounts to about 20 to 30 kilometers of basinward salt flow over these exhumed mantle structures. And I'm going to talk more about that in a few slides. So at the top of this lower Jurassic section, again, we don't have the control to be able to say this is definitely Smackover. We observe similar structures, a lot of updip extension, and this down dip mini basins with really quite wide diapirs that will ultimately close. By the end of the Jurassic, there was significant deposition over the salt, compression and closing of these diapirs. And this section has a couple interesting points worth pointing out. And here's the Cretaceous. So again, we see that really thick carbonate deposition up on the platform, very thin, even pinching out Cretaceous in the deep water. Okay, so one of the really interesting things about this line is the clarity of the pre-salt section. We feel fairly confident in our interpretation here. But the second is the thickness of the Jurassic section is really thick, thickest than any other line we see, which suggests both significant sediment input, but also significant accommodation space in this area during the Jurassic. And here is what all those look like. Again, that really thick Jurassic section, very thin Cretaceous. So you really see that locus of deposition shifting from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous. And here is that conjugate interpretation. So again, I really want to focus on the original salt basin, which is down here. And I've actually cut off part of this line. This would be part of line US2, just so it would fit better on the slide. So the salt basin here was almost 400 kilometers wide. It contained 1.8 to 2 kilometers of thick salt, and it was in about 1.5 kilometers of water. And again, I interpret the salt basin being deposited in sort of a pre-exhumation sin thinning basin. And then, by the time we get to the sort of these Jurassic deposits, the mantle exhumation has commenced. And what I want to point out here is, so in Mexico, I've interpreted that there's this really significant salt flow out onto the exhumed mantle. Whereas in the US, the early Jurassic stratigraphy actually appears to be onlapping the exhumed mantle. So we see some really different sort of paleo-topography and even probably driven by tectonics on the two conjugates. So why is that? Well, it could be the result of greater sediment input in the US, potentially, or a result of this exhumation geometry, which appears relatively asymmetric in this location. So what I want to do now is just sort of launch into a discussion of some of the interesting observations and interpretations that have come out of going through this exercise of doing the structural restoration. So the first thing I want to talk about is this supersalt extension and compression. And the post-Jurassic deformation is pretty low. It's less than 1 kilometer for all the sections. So I really focused this investigation on the Jurassic deformation. So what I did was I measured the amount of a long section extension and compression expressed on each Jurassic horizon, and then I summed them for the total Jurassic deformation. And that is shown here on this plot. So this is that deformation shown up on the y-axis, and then here are the 4 lines that I did, showing the amount of extension, the amount of compression. The yellow is the amount of visible measured deformation, and the blue is sort of cryptic. It's inferred. And what's interesting is that the amount of measured extension is consistently an order of magnitude higher than the amount of measured compression. So we can see 18 to 30 kilometers of measured extension across each one of these lines, less than 3 kilometers of measured shortening. So what this indicates is that in these salt basins, something like 85 to 100% of the compression, that should say, might be cryptic, might be hidden. So this is really symptomatic of this sort of this ability of salt to hide deformation. You know, salt presents a really unique décollement. It voids our rules about the up dip extension equaling the down dip compression. You know, in a normal linked system, you know, you want these to be equal. And, you know, to be fair, they're equal here too. It's just that the salt has this ability to hide the deformation by squeezing and growing diapirs, by flowing salt out of plane. So we propose that this cryptic deformation is accommodated by those mobile salt structures, as well as to a slight degree by the salt basin actually widening. Another thing I want to point out here too is that the regions of extension and shortening actually change through time. So here at the time of the top smackover, had this really broad region of observed extension. That region shrinks by the time you get to the top of the Jurassic. Same with the regions of shortening. So what you actually see is the extension sort of marching up dip through time. So I want to talk more about this salt basin widening because I've mentioned it a couple of times and it's something I actually measured. And what I mean by this is it's the difference between the modern width of the salt basin and our interpreted original width of the salt basin. So that's shown, those measures are shown here. So this is a long strike distance. The brown is the modern salt basin length and the gray is the original salt basin length. So the difference between those two would be this amount of salt basin widening. The amount is pretty, pretty modest on all the lines. It's only about 4 to 8 kilometers, with the exception of this one line MX2, which has 27 kilometers of salt basin widening. So that really stands out. So I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on there. So first of all, I want to say that we interpret that this salt basin widening, it was driven by ongoing rifting and exhumation, but also this gravitational salt flow, right? So we see the widening always occurs in the most distal region, so in or past the outer marginal trough. And the outer marginal trough, which is this area of sort of high relief in the distal part of the salt basin, it's always been a bit of a mystery, but the high relief that we actually see here is really indicative of ongoing tectonism and exhumation. So just the fact that we even see relief out there, to me, indicates that there was ongoing exhumation at that time. Okay, so let's talk about this line that has by far the most basin widening, clocking in at 27 kilometers. This line has some other curiosities. For one, it has the widest, well, it has a very wide original salt basin. It has the thickest salt, the thickest Jurassic section, and the greatest amount of super salt deformation. So it has a lot going for it. And the part of the reason that this salt basin widening is so high in this line is that we interpret that the original salt basin as sort of, just reaching the end of what we interpret to be continental crust, and then that the rest of it was a lochfinous salt flow. So why did I interpret it that way? Why didn't I just say this could have been the original salt basin width? Well, one reason I did that comes back to sort of my trying to follow certain rules about how much salt was there originally and how much salt do we observe today. So what was sort of that degree of salt decrease? And if I had let the salt come all the way out to where we see it here, it would have presented a very thick salt basin, just an incredible amount of salt that was hard to defend. So instead, I limited it to here. The amount of salt was still reasonable. It's still sort of, it still is the greatest amount of salt decrease that we see on any line. So, but it was within the limits I was comfortable with. So, is my interpretation defensible then? Well, I think it could be very possible that this region was exhuming really asymmetrically and that there was significant crustal extension and mantle exhumation that occurred post-salt and allowed that salt to flow out allochthenously. Alternatively, there could have been a lot less basin widening and just a really significant amount of salt dissolution or out of plane movement here. I don't pretend to know unequivocally what the answer is, but I hope I've defended my sufficiently. Okay, so So our restorations provide the first basin-wide measurements and descriptions of the original Gulf of Mexico conjugate margin salt basin. So they can be used to make inferences about the early GOM tectonic morphic setting. So our results indicate a conjugate basin width that widens from 175 kilometers in the southeast to about 400 kilometers in that east central GOM. The salt was 1.2 to 1.8 kilometers thick and about 1.2 to 1.5 kilometers of water. So just to summarize that, as we move from the eastern GOM to the central GOM, we see a wider, deeper basin with thicker salt. In our study area, our results indicate that salt is mostly late rift, pre-mantle exhumation, based on the nature of that post-salt crustal extension. Interestingly, the deepest salt on each line does not occur over that most distal extent in the location of the crustal split. In all cases, the deepest part of the salt basin, so what I'm talking about there is the thickest salt, it occurs tens of kilometers from our interpreted down dip salt limit, suggesting that some mechanism was causing surface uplift in the down dip area where crustal breakup would ultimately occur. And this actually fits with most models that we know of that involve mantle exhumations. What we're really talking about here is a metamorphic core complex. And any model of a metamorphic core complex involves pretty significant exhumation of that complex as it comes to the surface. And so that's what I propose as the model here that's sort of driving some of this surface uplift at the time of salt deposition. And then as it spread more and more, you saw a lot of relief in that outer marginal trough area. So this plot, sorry, you guys have already seen that. This is just the modern and original salt basin length. And this shows the thickness of the salt in red for each line, and then the water depth that I interpret. Okay, so the final topic I want to talk about came from the subsidence analyses I undertook as part of the restoration process. So as I've already mentioned, in the process of doing these restorations, it included sequential sedimentary backstripping and decompaction, a flexural isostatic correction, and a thermal isostatic correction. So I'm going through this process systematically, sequentially. What would happen is when I got to the Mesozoic units, I consistently faced this scenario where the backstrip section was significantly deeper than it should be, than it needed to be, and it required this sort of positive bathymetric correction. So these plots here just show 1D analyses, subsidence analyses. These are based on the 2D restorations, but it's sort of easier to visualize on a 1D plot like this. All of these locations are up on the carbonate platform. I did that because there's no salt tectonics to influence the subsidence, and we have really good bathymetric constraints because it was a lot of carbonate platform. So we know it must have been very close to sea level. Okay, and so what you see is, starting at the present, you're sort of marching back in time. Everything is hunky-dory until the early Cretaceous, right around 120 million years ago, where I start to need to add somewhere between 500 meters to a kilometer of bathymetric correction. I don't have the well control or the resolution in Mexico for these sort of intra-Cretaceous bedding, but you can see by the time you get to the Jurassic, you have the same problem here. It's over a kilometer of bathymetric correction is necessary. So the question is, of course, what is going on here? So of course, my first assumption was that something must be wrong with my model inputs. What could be causing this? Well, I need to rule out a few of these things before I start saying that this is significant. So one, it could be that the sediment was muddier than I thought, right? So it was actually experiencing a much greater degree of compaction. Okay, so I checked that. It did not solve the problem. Okay, maybe it's that the beta factor is actually far higher than I thought, right? Maybe the original crustal thickness was greater. Okay, well, I checked that too. Didn't do the trick. Okay, maybe the pre-salt section was a lot more sedimentary than crystalline. So I checked that also. And what I'm showing here is the effect of that sensitivity analysis. The blue line shows sort of a minimum subsidence scenario. And what these lines are here, this is the base of salt and its equivalent from this, this is line US1 section. So I know that's small, but that's the surface that I'm showing here. So the blue line is where that surface would sit after sort of a minimum subsidence scenario. So in that, I used a granitic subsalt and a very conservative beta factor based on 35-kilometer original crustal thickness. The yellow line is the sort of maximum subsidence scenario. I used a higher beta factor based on 40-kilometer crustal thickness. It uses muddier lithologies to increase the decompaction, and it uses a sedimentary pre-salt section. And what you can see is that it just does not do the trick. Even with making all those changes, it's still sitting way below where we know it ought to, which is up here at the surface. So the difference does make it, there's a bit of a difference, especially here, it's maybe 100 meters to 200 meters, not sufficient to explain what I am observing. So here's the magnitude of that vertical discrepancy through time. You can see this is time on the x-axis, this is the vertical discrepancy on the y-axis, and here's all 4 of my lines. You can see these little nubby lines at the early on, those are all within error. So, there's no discrepancy really until we hit the Cretaceous, where we start to need half a kilometer to a kilometer of correction. And then again, there's another period of time here where we need a correction, which is the Jurassic. So there's two key periods of time here that stand out, where something was causing vertical movements that are not accounted for with any of our obvious corrections. It's not with an error. It's on the order of 500 meters to a kilometer. So what is causing this? What is this? Well, frankly, we don't know. So we're thinking that mantle influence is a potential culprit. So mantle dynamics like upwelling and downwelling can cause really long wavelength, short amplitude topographic changes. Short amplitude would be on the order of a few hundred meters to a kilometer, so the order that we're observing. And these are often really difficult to observe, but observations such as those I've shown here, these anomalous vertical movements, they can help test dynamic topography hypotheses. So we're not sure if that's what's going on here, but it's definitely an area for some future work. Okay, and with that, I can see that I'm out of time. So what I'll do is I'll just leave this up here. You can look at the 2 conjugate restorations and check out my conclusions, and I'll open it up here now to any questions.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maggie. That was really, really, really interesting. Super. Yeah, amazing data and amazing work. So congrats. Beforehand, before actually starting asking questions, I also have a lot of questions. But yeah, see, my first thing I'd like to comment, I was really pleased to see these extent, the widening of the salt basin right after doing the end of salt deposition right after by crustal tectonics and thick skin shortening, extension. So that was really interesting to see evidence of that. So I'm going to start from, with the Q&A questions. So the first actually, I think is a comment from Frank Peel. So great talk. And he mentions that another factor contributing to the lack of definition of the early gone from potential fields is the spread initiating during the Jurassic quiet zone. Interpreted to have been a time when the Earth's magnetic field was weak and with rapidly changing polarity. And if the magnetic stripes exist, they were very narrow, very weak stripes. So there were no magnetic stripes so visible in the current data. So I don't know if you want to comment.
No, I'll just say thanks, Frank. Yeah, that's I think I've heard that before. So that's a good point. And yeah, it makes it's unfortunate because it does make it hard for us to use that magnetic data in the way we might like.
Yeah. Right. So the next one's from Mario Moreno Vega. So he actually refers to slide 19 in the pre-salt seems much shallower in the rate of regional later.
The pre-salt seems much shallower. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I understand the question. So I think the question is sort of about, how this is sort of raised up here above regional. And if I understand your question correctly, Mario, I think is your question that could this area have been raised above regional later? If that's correct, the answer is definitely yeah. I think the reason I brought it up to this level is because that's where we see the pinch out of salt, and we also see the pinch out of the top Smackover and the top Jurassic. So it seems pretty likely that this was an area of non-deposition. It might not have been quite this high as I put it here. It might have been a little lower, but the chance that it was raised up later. Oh, I think I see what you mean, because the salt basin is so much smaller. I actually don't think so. I think that up dip limit of salt that we observe, as I said, this is one of the rules that we followed. If there had been flow of the salt, it was going to be down dip. So I don't actually think that the salt basin came up much higher. We just don't see evidence for it. And even the later units really pinch out, pretty close to this. So I don't think, okay, I think if I understand your question, I think you're wondering, did the salt sort of flow this way? Did it used to come up higher? I mean, I'm not going to say it's totally impossible, but I think it's unlikely.
Okay, yeah, I think you answered spot on. Yeah, I think that was probably what was referring to.
And part of that, sorry, if I could just add on,
well.
is that the salt that we observe, the sort of thin salt that we observe in the really up dip areas, this is not mobile salt. Actually, it's thin. It's probably more likely sort of a mix, like maybe even an anhydrite facies. This is not the same sort of mobile salt that you're viewing in the really thick regions where it's forming diapirs. So I really don't think that this area was doing much flowing.
So, like, what you mean is that your present day up dip pinch out was likely the regional up dip pinch out of the salt basin, right?
Yeah, that is our interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it makes sense, I think. But yeah, I'm glad to hear any other comments on that. So the next one from Juan Soto, he says, very good work and presentations. 2 questions. What type of behavior are you assuming to restore the deformation of the continental crusts? Some of your sections seem to indicate that it's entirely deforming by ductile flow. So if you want to answer that before, and then I can answer the second question.
Yeah. What type of deformation? So I guess I can use this one. So I think, when mantle is involved, I think that there's a chance of some ductile flow, but I do think that it was probably still acting mostly brittly. And, I should probably say that, and I tried to point this out, that the crustal, the sort of basement interpretation here, it's very difficult. And so this is really sort of a model for how we think it would work. It's based on our observations, but I wouldn't do a lot of sort of quantitative measures, for example, on the offset on those that mantle exhumation, because a lot of it is a little bit of inference, just because it's so hard to image that area. We really don't know very well what that is. So this is an interpretation. So I hope that answers your question. And then the second part of it, have you evaluated the role of lithospheric mantle during your restorations? Without this, backstripping is also quite temptative. Yeah, we did. That was part of the restorations. I'm not sure how thoroughly you want me to answer that. But yeah, the restorations were done sort of considering what could be the different crustal architectures.
Yeah. A comment like I was a bit intrigued is that you have a very narrow margin, especially for the northeast most sections. So I mean maybe I just don't know enough about because it's not my area of expertise, but in this more ductile style of deformation of rifting, you tend to have pretty wide margins, right? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, like why you have such a narrow margin on that setting if you actually have ductile crustal flow or mantle exhumation?
Yeah, well, for one thing, it was interesting to me as well when I was doing this, that the sort of asymmetry that I observed on the two sides. So I think you're right, you know, particularly this line here, it's a pretty narrow margin. But I'd also say this is, you know, this is an area where we had supplemental 3D. So we feel pretty good about, you know, I feel pretty good about the width of that margin, you know, that I don't think it was much bigger than that. I think that
I'm with you on that.
was,
I agree with the width totally. I think it's right. Yeah.
yeah, but I think if there was that, you know, sort of that the mantle exhumation and potential for ductile flow, it was concentrated down dip. I don't think that that was affecting. I think this was much more brittle. Sorry, my mouse is sort of jumping around awkwardly, but I think what was going on up here was not ductile flow. This was sort of your classic, you know, continental extension until you get out to the most distal area, where I think you really have a change and to a more, yeah, sort of mantle exhumation type setting.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, Juan also says thank you. So the next one from Mark Rowan. So Maggie, just as you have cryptic shortening, could you not have cryptic subsalt extension? So we can say how much of the early supersalt extension is gravitational.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for that comment, actually. And you know, while I was making this, I was kind of thinking, you know, I probably should mention that, but of course I didn't. But definitely, I mean, we measured the amount of extension there. You know, there definitely might have been cryptic extension as well. The extension is a little bit easier to handle because, you know, we really see a lot of these sort of up dip, you know, salt roller type, you know, salt facilitated extension. So it's a little easier to measure, but yeah, there definitely could have been some, particularly in sort of the down dip diapiric region that we are no longer seeing. So I would say that the super salt deformation could have been more than what, you know, what I'm saying is a minimum. So can we say how much of the early super salt extension is gravitational? How much of it? I think if I understand that question correctly, and you know, feel free to speak up if I'm misunderstanding it. I think you're wondering, you know, how much more could there have been? You know, so what I have sort of measured is pretty much all gravitational. I mean, salt deformation is pretty much all driven by gravity, right? But there might have been some that we're not observing. So I think what you're asking is how much of it might have been what I'm observing and how much more could there have been? Yeah, about the cryptic, okay, the cryptic subsalt.
Yeah, he mentioned.
Yeah.
I think he mentions that. I don't know, Mark also feel free to reply. Maybe I think he refers to how much of this widening of the salt basin may actually be thick skin extension, or how much of this widening may be gravity driven salt flow onto the newly formed crust or the mantle. I don't know if that's exactly what he means. Yes, I think that's what he means.
Okay. Yeah, well, I guess I don't know how much it could have been. So, you know, I measured that sort of salt basin widening. So that's really on the order of just a few kilometers. So that would add, you know, maybe on the order of 5 kilometers of, you know, more cryptic extension. But so if I'm measuring 20 kilometers of gravitational measured extension, that would mean, you know, something like 80% of it is gravitational, and some of it's driven by salt basin widening. But I'm not totally sure I'm understanding the question. And I might just not know the answer to that. So okay, sorry.
Yeah. It's a very hard question, Mark.
Please do contact me, Mark.
No, yeah, thanks. I think that was great. So I'm gonna do a couple more questions and then I'll pass to Connor. He's there already. So the next one I think is from Byron. Yeah, I'll just follow the order. I think my Q&A, I have to apologize for everyone if I kind of skip the order because it keeps switching the names. I don't know why. So just gonna follow the list here, okay? Byron Veilleux, I think is Veilleux, that's the best I can do with my French. Thanks for a great talk. I had similar difficulty accounting for subsidence in the Santos of Brazil, Santos Basin. What percentage thickening did you assume for the salt? And how did you determine your salt basin water depth? Was it all subsidence based, or did you have some paleo-bathymetry?
All right, thanks for the question. So first question, what percentage thickening did you assume for the salt? I might need you to clarify that because I don't assume the salt thickened through time. So maybe that one you could explain some more, but I can talk about how I determine the salt basin water depth. I'm going to hop back up here to this one. So the way I really determined it is I kind of backed it out. So, I followed these rules. So I have the up dip pinch out of salt. I limited the slope I would put on the salt to 1 degree. So, it couldn't be, I wouldn't let it be deeper than that. So that's one limitation I put on it. What else? I basically said, okay, well, I'm not going to let it come farther up than this limit of continental crust. So between that and the 1 degree slope, I kind of put sort of a framework on it that I decided was acceptable. Now, if I change this 1 degree slope to be deeper or, bring it up to sea level, that would really change the water depth, right? So I don't have, bugs or anything like that to help me with this paleo-bathymetry, but this has been a constant problem, right? Working in the salt basin. So I guess, I sort of set these reasonable rules and I followed them. And I used what evidence I could, for example, I did use like those first deposits, as sort of a limit. I knew it had to come up to that so that the mini basins could move. But yeah, I really just sort of backed it out by following these rules. Was it all subsidence? Okay. Honestly, the subsidence analysis didn't help me much because as I went over, I had these crazy, vertical movements. So, it didn't help me at all because that would have put the salt basin like, really just like completely unreasonable depth. You stated that the salt was a minimum. I thought you stated at the start you assumed some thickening of the salt on your rest. Okay, so I think I see what you mean. So what I did was I allowed the cross-sectional area of the salt at the original cross-sectional area of the salt to be greater than what we observe at present. And I attribute that salt loss to both dissolution and out of plane movement. How much did I allow that to change? Well, I started out with 50%. And that worked for 3 of the 4 lines. But when I got to that one line, the one I talked about where I had a lot of allochthonous salt flow, that didn't work. And I think that one is greater. I'm sorry, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it was something like, I want to say it's like 25% different. Okay, so 25% meaning the modern salt basin is 25% cross-sectional area compared to what I observe compared to what I interpret the original salt basin to be. So I tried to have a rule that ended up not working because of that one line. I hope that helps, Byron.
Yeah,
I can
actually, no, I actually just wanted to comment on that because that's very interesting. I had a similar situation kind of thing locally in Brazil in an area that I use huge discrepancies in salt volume in the restoration, so salt area through time. So do you think that larger discrepancy of 25%, well, actually you have 75% less, could be because you had greater degree of extension of subsalt extension in that line? Do you think it could be related to that? And that's why you have the wider nap as well. You may have more extension. I felt like I needed to say that because I'm overlapping what I was doing as well. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, sorry. So you broke up a little bit, but yeah, no, I mean, I do think it's all related. I mean, I think there's a lot of unique points about that one line. I tried to point them out. So that's why I do think that my interpretation of it, even though it stands out as odd, which, to a lot of us, that's probably like, ooh, we want to think something's wrong, but it also has sort of a lot of unique aspects. So, it still could be wrong, but
I don't know. I think it's it's impressive work, and it's a very complex questions that you're trying to answer. So it's not easy at all. I actually gonna pass on to Connor to follow up with the Q&A, and I would like to thank you again, Maggie, and congratulations for the excellent work and in the presentation as well. So cheers and bye. Thank you, everyone. Connor.
Cheers, Leo.
To you.
Yeah,
All
great
right.
talk, Maggie. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And
I found it really cool that I'm completely unfamiliar with the Gulf of Mexico. So seeing that it was essentially at, hyperextension, oceanic crust formation, sort of coeval with the salt deposition, to me was really cool.
very good.
So we're at 3. Are you happy to go through a few more questions before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I do need to go soon. I could probably give you about 5 more minutes.
Okay, we've got it. We'll squeeze in a few more then.
Okay.
So the next one is from Heman Koi, and he asks, how much cross-sectional area decrease and when?
It's a really
He
good question.
follows that up with, he's got a little sub-question, if not due to dissolution, decrease of salt in a section may lead to increase in a section.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thanks. Unfortunately, I don't have those numbers right at my fingertips. But it is something I recorded, so that exists, but I don't have it. I don't have it at my fingertips. What I can say, maybe if I can go to one of these restoration, let's go to maybe this one. What I can say is that the change in that cross-sectional area almost entirely occurs during the Jurassic. All right, so by the time we get to the Cretaceous, really, the salt is as it is at present, for the most part. That's not. And that's obviously not true everywhere in the Gulf of Mexico. That's just my study area. We know that there's loads of salt tectonics occurring much, until present day elsewhere. But in my study area, by the time we get to the top of the Cretaceous, for most of these lines, we're not seeing a lot of salt tectonics. So that most of that cross-sectional area change is occurring in the Jurassic. And mostly really in I would say most of it's occurring in the earliest steps of the restoration. I don't have the exact numbers and times at my fingertips, but you'll have to look out for the paper that's hopefully going to be submitted soon. And you're right, your second comment is totally right. It's probably partially dissolution, but you're right. If you're decreasing salt in one section, right, it's flowing somewhere. So that's the 2D problem. That if I wish I had just massive 3D data sets, but unfortunately I don't.
Don't we all? We've got a question from Kate Giles here. So thank you for a great summary, Maggie. What is the tectonic origin of the Appalachia embayment, LPM basin, and why no UPM fill there? I assume you know what UPM means because I don't.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Kate. Thanks. So first part of that, what is the tectonic origin for the Appalachia embayment? I believe that this is a remnant from the northwest southeast rifting, that initial rifting of Pangea. Let me just hop back up to here and show you that real quick. So when the basin first started forming, you had this northwest southeast oriented rifting, and you actually have a lot of basement structures that are sort of left over from that. And I believe the Appalachia embayment and the Florida Middle Ground Arch and some other structures around the Gulf of Mexico are due to that initial rifting. Sorry, let me get back to that other one now, which was too far. Yeah. Why no upper pre-salt mega sequence there? Mostly because the data is really bad. What I interpreted is I could see what looked like some growth strata, but so I put that there, but it's really hard to interpret this area. I didn't have any 3D over it. And so I couldn't confidently say what was going on there.
Nice one. We've got one more question in the Q&A. It's the second one from Frank. And Frank says, do we need to refine the maps showing the limit of continental basement based on your new interpretation of the sections? On the map shown here, I think the continental crust extent included regions where you see the UPM and LPM pre-salt sections sitting above mantle lower crust, but the pink basement is missing, e.g. on Fig 19. Crustal split where pre-salt section splits, not where the pink crystalline basement splits.
Yeah.
So new maps.
Rick. Yeah, we probably do. we made that map many years ago now. It probably could be updated a little bit.
Excellent. That's everything from the Q&A. We have a few questions in the chat. How are you doing for time, Maggie? 1 or 2 more, or are we all done? How you feeling?
I really need to go in about 1 minute. So if you see a short
That's
one.
all right. Well, we'll say anyone whose question wasn't answered, send an email to the AAPG Salt Basins email, and we'll forward it to Maggie on your
Yeah,
behalf.
by all means, let me know. I'm really, this is even though it was work done a while ago, it's still a work in progress. It's something we're still trying to sort of get out there. So I'm curious to hear feedback from the community.
Oh, it's really cool. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. All right. Well, great. Thanks very much to the Salt Basins Technical Interest Group for this invitation. This was fun, and thanks everyone for the good questions.
That's great, Maggie. Thanks everybody, and see you in 2 weeks' time. Enjoy the rest of your weeks, everybody.
All right.